So the motion is, this House believes that the Commonwealth should have a militarized peacekeeping force.
So before I start my speech, it's kind of like a culture in Ghana to give shout-outs. So I'd like to shout out the coach who is still in Ghana, who couldn't make it here. I'm really grateful for the support he has been giving us continually. I'd like to shout out the Sport Directorate for funding us and helping us come here and continually supporting us. Their help is very, very evident in how far we've come. We are really, really grateful and hope that they continue to help us. And I'm thankful to everyone who has helped my debate career, all my friends who continually ask me about how the competition is going. You guys are the best. Thank you. Right. Starting my debate in 3, 2, 1. In status quo, the Commonwealth has lost relevance. What that means is that it's seen almost as generally symbolic in status quo. This is evidenced by the fact that people don't necessarily understand how the Commonwealth works, but then the youth generally don't regard the Commonwealth as a world power as compared to other things such as BRICS, the UN, or other startups or other alternatives which are coming up in status quo in today's debate. What that means is that at the end of it all, there's a certain conversation of relevance which must be had and how we are capable of actually impacting the world in a world which is constantly changing and which we are constantly losing relevance. We engage that case in today's debate. But the second thing we have to look at in the Commonwealth structure is the kind of countries which make up the Commonwealth. Apart from 4 major countries being Canada, United States, Australia, and New Zealand, the vast majority of countries within the Commonwealth in of itself are developing countries in of itself. This characterization is really, really relevant when you start to take into consideration the nature of these countries and how, to a certain degree, they've been disenfranchised, which inherently justifies certain actions we'll be taking today's debate on our side. Right? Third thing we have to look at is what the Commonwealth necessarily stands for in today's debate and why it's extremely, extremely relevant. Because the Commonwealth stands for a number of things, among those things being democracy, the protection of human rights, and the continued sustenance and development of these countries in of itself. We think that a world which is fundamentally justified in today's debate is a world which is capable of holding the Commonwealth core tenets into consideration in today's debate and benefiting the world significantly at the end of it all, right? Panel conversations on competition and buy-in and how BRICS is taking over the conversation in today's status quo is something we think are extremely, extremely relevant. We're engaging the rest of the things in today's debate as integrated framing and characterization. First case in today's debate, principle. We think that in status quo, Great Britain colonized Africa and like the vast majority of the countries which are part, right? And in to a certain capacity, contributed to the fact that these countries are still developing in the nature they work. What this means is that, in essence, Great Britain fundamentally weakened these states and the way these states happen or work together, right? What that means is that Great Britain is directly linked to the lagging development of these countries and the fact that these countries aren't growing to the capacity they could have potentially grown to. We therefore think that it affects all the sectors within this country, including the agricultural sector, the economy, etc., etc. But more importantly, state security and the military in of itself. Integrated framing and characterization. In status quo right now, there has been an insurgence of nationalistic tendencies and ideologies, as well as an insurgence of violence and wars across the world. This is evident to the fact that in the last 3 years, we've had like 4 major wars going on, including wars in Sudan, South Sudan, as well as the fact that there are constant coups happening within the African continent and among Commonwealth countries in today's debate, right? We think that at the end of today's debate, we think that at the point where there's a need for state security in these developing countries in order for a better development to happen, it's fundamentally justified for them to actually be looking at state security and the military development in of itself. But therefore, we believe that there's a certain level of importance and relevance that is inherently attached to the state security and development of these countries in of itself. Because without state security and without the military, a lot of things can happen. For example, there's a loss of investor confidence in the area due to the fact that at any point in time, people can't invest in these areas. These places are unsafe, number one. But number two, it also means that in the vast majority of instances, these countries are incapable of actually using the money they get to actually develop, because now they have to think about protecting their military, because at any point in time there can be an insurgence of violence due to the current nature of the world which exists in status quo, right? But second piece of like argumentation we think is important. The Commonwealth inherently within its tenets looks for the growth of all the countries within its group in the security and democracy of these countries in of itself, right? The evidence for this is evidence in the fact that the Commonwealth actively looks for ways to make sure these countries help themselves to develop, but the Commonwealth actively calls out countries which don't act in a democratic manner, who act antagonistic to the main ideologies of the Commonwealth of itself. Case in point, Zimbabwe in 2003 and how Zimbabwe eventually left. What that means is that the Commonwealth inherently holds its ideologies and principles to a very high regard in today's debate, and it's something we have to take into consideration, because if they hold it to a very high regard in today's debate, that means that they are likely to act upon it and want the state security of itself in today's debate, right? What does this mean in today's debate? What are the impacts we have to take into consideration? It means that to a certain capacity, the Commonwealth and Great Britain of itself is capable of giving a certain level of reparation to today's debate to the people who are most important to need it and the people who are most likely to actually take it into consideration in today's debate, right? But we think that secondly, it's fundamentally principally justified to take these actions to of itself, right? But secondly, and very importantly, why doesn't it weaken these developing states? Because their claims are going to be that, oh, these countries are developing. If we take some of their military to go and like make an army in today's debate, then we can weaken them. We think that in today's debate, the military force is most likely going to be made up of multiple members of all the Commonwealth countries coming together to take action. We think the reason why this isn't very likely is because at the point where they give us small amounts of their 56 different countries to make up a military, they make a much bigger military, which is more likely going to be used to protect these people if they're in danger. What that means is that the conversation of being weakened doesn't really exist because the Commonwealth has an incentive to move these people to protect them, mean that they have a larger force and a larger buy into this debate. The conversation of being weakened into this debate doesn't necessarily exist. But what further impacts does it mean? It means that it fills up the weakness which exists in status quo, because in status quo right now, the world is in a bad state and these developing countries don't have the military support to protect themselves in status quo. Case in point, Singapore, and the fact that Singapore doesn't necessarily have a standing military due to the fact that Singapore has developed so much in terms of technological advancement in order to be capable of reaching the level of development which is essentially important in today's bit. We think that in status quo, it is justified for them to try and fill up these weaknesses in status quo, because then it allows the developing countries to actually think about realistic development, one of the core tenets of what the Commonwealth is in today's bit. But it builds an impression of protection, something which is very, very important in status quo for investor development, for investor confidence, and the ability for these countries to develop of itself. Before that, 520 POI. No POI from OO, POI from CO. No POI from them. Second principle in today's debate and why we should be winning today's debate. We think that other organizations which exist with the same fundamental principles and purposes have militaries in of itself in today's debate. Case in point, ECOWAS in the United States of America. ECOWAS in today's debate exists solely and fundamentally for the purpose of the economic emancipation of the people of West Africa. But even though they exist for this purpose, they feel that due to the fact that they have a military, they are better capable of reaching these goals in today's debate. We think that at the point where other organizations are like have the capability of doing this and have the military in order to take these actions, we think it's fundamentally and principally justified for them to also take these actions to benefit themselves. POI.
What say do these states that are likely to be invaded have over their own economy?
Great. So we think that in the vast majority of instances, these states aren't going to be invaded randomly by the Commonwealth of Nations. We think that in the instances where they do something significantly bad, such as infringe upon the rights of human beings, such as what happened in the genocide in Rwanda, we think it's then justified for the peacekeeping of the Commonwealth to actively go into these countries to protect these people and to make sure that, if nothing at all, extremely bad things do not happen. We think that in today's debate, the more realistic world is that they are not just going to be invading people and just be doing anything rash, but it's going to be active or like reactive to certain negative things which exist in status quo, right? But Pano, there's going to be a third case on the impact it has on the countries in terms of their ability to like get a certain level of relevance in status quo. Because note, in status quo, a lot of other countries are getting buy-in. This is evident from the fact that the BRICS has been having a lot of conversation in status quo, but constantly tries to go after countries with which they believe in a way which they believe is non-aligned. This is evident from the fact that they are going to Kenya to go and build ports for them. They are having active, tangible impact for these individuals. The comparative in status quo right now is that the Commonwealth does things, but no one really sees them. Last month, they went to Nigeria to help a lot of war veterans to deal with some of the trauma they've dealt with. Vast majority, in fact, I believe that half of us over here haven't even heard of that. We think that the more impactful and relevant thing is a world where they can actively be seen to be having tangible impact on the countries where they are actively working in. We think the best world to buy into is a world with tangible impact, where the Commonwealth continually has purpose and continually has relevance. The best side to vote for in today's debate is opening government. Here.
Hi. Okay. So before I start, I'd like to thank everyone for showing up. It was a good tournament, and regardless of the result, you've put yourself forward, and that's what is important. So shout out everyone. So shout out to the UN guys, University of Nairobi. I know they'll watch this someday. So shout out to you guys, the entire Kenyan fraternity, the guys that show us the way and encourage us. Okay. So I'm starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. So I think a bit of contextual analysis about the Commonwealth is imperative if you are going to get anywhere. A bit of a history lesson. Let me be boring and a professor and do a lot of these things. What did the British Empire look like pre-Commonwealth? They had colonies, dominions, and territories, and they enforced their power over a lot of these other states through the monopoly of force. That is something that they don't want to recognize and something that is true. However, when the paradigm of independence came and there was a struggle for independence by a lot of these countries in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, there was then a strife for these countries to be liberated, right? So then a Commonwealth was formed, and the idea was we're all going to be equal members, and like the 56 countries that agree, at least on paper, are supposed to be members that are like equal in the Commonwealth, and like that disparity in terms of power has been mitigated, right? Therefore, we think then you'll be like hurting the sovereignty of a lot of these states, because we think that these countries are in very delicate positions, right? And this is the crux of our case and what I'm going to run. We think the Commonwealth is largely run by the very, very countries that he's talked about. At least they have the most say. They contribute resources. A lot of the times they will make a lot of the calls on a lot of the fundamental things. So the countries like, you know, Canada, the New Zealand, and all of these countries. So then we think the reason this framing becomes particularly important is because, like, in the paradigm that we exist in, a lot of these countries that were recently colonized are still trying to figure out their issues, right? They'll come and they're still trying to figure out democracy. They're still trying to figure out like good economic policy and these kinds of things. We think a lot of these wounds become fresh. And what you do by forming this body becomes simple. You're offering a sort of legitimization of the monopoly of force that these countries once had, and you're legitimizing it, and like you're bringing it to these countries, and that we think becomes very problematic. This is true because of two major reasons. One, the countries that initially like did the pillaging, or at least were privy to it, even if did not do it directly, still hold that power in status quo. These countries are still the most powerful, but intersect that with the fact that a lot of these countries that they colonized are still powerful becomes exponentially worse, and you can't get solvency for a lot of those issues. We think then the autonomy of these countries, the state power, everything that they have going on for them will like be fundamentally taken backwards. We think then that becomes particularly problematic. So like when OG said that the Commonwealth is losing relevance, we think to a great degree that's not true. A lot of these countries in the Commonwealth conform in a lot of ways to like the colonizer and that kind of thing, right? We think our legal systems are largely in tune towards these people. Even in legal systems, the way we study law, a lot of case laws we borrow from like British common law from like the 1800s or something. We think they form like a very, very fundamental part of how these countries are run anyway. And like there's need for these countries to exercise a sort of autonomy that suits them, right? So then what am I going to run? Like a few principles. So the first one is like the state, the sovereignty of the state, and like the principle of sovereignty that a state is entitled to, right? So we say like the state power principle, like a state in and of itself has power over you in so many ways, and it exerts a lot of dominance on you. You approximate to that state if you live in that state or you are of that state. That means that you inhabit a lot of the problems, and it shapes you to be whatever it is you think you want to be. We therefore think then this is foreign interference that is exacerbated by legitimizing this, because remember, they were able to exert a lot of this dominance using like the monopoly of force and that kind of thing, right? They're able to legitimize and like subdue these states because like they had a lot of military power like to hold over them, right? We then think then why is it likely to be the same here, right? Even if like on paper like these countries will be equal and like will intervene like, you know, very equally, and whichever country needs what. One, it's unlikely that it will be these countries that did the pillaging and were like the colonizers in the first place, because a lot of the times they've set the standard as to what is acceptable in society and status quo and that kind of thing. We then think that it's unlikely that they'll be the one who will have their countries invaded and that kind of thing, right? Secondly, the countries that need it are like a lot of the time like the globally south countries, these sub-Saharan countries, some countries in Asia or that kind of thing. We think then that becomes very, very likely that you intersect that, it becomes like extremely problematic. We don't think that this is something that we are likely to deal with. If you want to know that this is true, look at status quo. Look at what is happening in Niger and a lot of these countries in West Africa, right? Look at like the disembowelment, and like look at how they've sent away a lot of the French establishments that have been there. They've had to flee for their lives and that kind of thing. Colonialism ended like 60 years ago. The idea is that we colonized you, now we'll help you in whichever you need, we'll give aid and these kinds of things. But it's been 60 years of these people not getting what they deserve and that kind of thing. So we think then this becomes particularly problematic, and like it's very likely that it will be exacerbated to a greater degree. It becomes more likely because it already happens in status quo without such a body. Now, in terms of a body that has like legitimization of violence, actual force, you going with people, you going with like armor and that kind of thing to a country, we then think you're more likely to like do these things anyway. The impacts of these, you pillage them a lot on like a lot of their resources, right? You pillage their resources, you like subdue their people, you like you enforce policy that only like enhances a lot of their growth and that kind of thing. I'll take closing first. Okay, thank you so much. So this is the idea. On paper, these things are always gonna be, we strive for peace and that kind of thing. We think what happens in the West and that kind of thing on paper is like, we want peace, with that kind of thing. But we think there are other like covert means that these things happen anyway, right? So the reason this is true is like, peacekeeping forces, they probably go there, they'll probably like attack a country that whose problems have not even been exacerbated to the degree where it needs like a lot of intervention, right? We think that's the first thing, right? The second thing is they'll probably use an excessive amount of force and that kind of thing, something more than is needed. They like incapacitate a lot of the organs that these states already have to defend themselves. We think then that you're likely to like take these countries back from like the progress that they've made, right? So then like furthering this principle, we say then that like you undermine the ability of the states to be able to like self-correct in some of these things. We acknowledge that they need interventions in a vast majority of instances. It just shouldn't be in the form of like military power. Give them aid, help them. Like alternatives are like give them have talks, have mediation talks, give them aid, do something softer than like a lot of the hard power, which is what kept them there in the first place, right? We think then this becomes like bad because these countries are still fragile. You'll just subdue them and like they'll go back to where they were, right? The impact of this is that you principally harm these citizens. Every person is a member of a state. They self-actualize in the state and they give a lot to that state in taxes and compliance to the law, right? You're then destroying a paradigm for a lot of these people to self-actualize. In terms of vulnerability, you're hurting these people. People who are striving to like make ends meet, you're making life difficult for them. This is the thing. You are poking at a fresh wound. There's no need to impose what initially kept them subdued in the first place. You're just going to exacerbate a lot of their problems. My partner will extend. Thank you.
All right. So before I start my speech, I would also like to say some things. Again, thank you very much, Elijah, for all the training and everything that you have done for us, and the support, even though you are not here, the calls and everything have meant a lot. And to my partner, Jedidiah, thank you very much. Even though this is like my first time partnering, it has been great. And thank you very much for doing this with me. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel OO is completely out of today's debate. Why? 1, they don't understand what peacekeeping forces are. Secondly, they don't understand the difference between different African countries, their colonial masters, and how they contribute to their African, like their development and their democracy. The conversation that they are trying to have on, like, they are impeding on your rights, they are impeding on your democracy, etc., are things that Britain does not do. The one state that actually does that in Africa is France. That state actively contributes or actively controls the central banks of these countries, like Niger, etc., and they do not contribute to anything that like they do, or even when they contribute, in most instances, it is not one that is like the people feel is to the best of their interest. They actively infiltrate their elections, etc., and put people that the people do not want in power. That is what France does, and that is not Britain. Britain in itself does not interfere in anybody's democracy. One, the only thing that they do in keeping our democracy is help us have safe elections, trying to supervise our elections, etc., to make sure that it is safe, free, and fair. That is exactly what they do. In today's debate, this debate cannot be about, Britain is going to Commonwealth is all of a sudden going to impede on our democracy and not going to allow us to develop and going to take money from us. That is not what Britain does. Actually, in most instances, Britain is not as much as hated as France because of the fact that they do not do all of those things that France actively does. But this debate cannot be about neocolonialism. Why? Because if that is the case, then this debate should not be happening. Then the Commonwealth should not exist in the first place. Because them giving you scholarships, them telling you that they are doing all of these things for you, is one that is also sometimes considered neo-colonialist. What that means is that in most instances, that cannot be the debate. The debate is whether the Commonwealth should take an action or should not take an action. What that means is that any actor that exists beyond the Commonwealth, taking an action is not what concerns us. What you are supposed to justify is whether the Commonwealth should take an action or the Commonwealth should not take that action, or the Commonwealth itself should take another action. That's what the debate is about. But then what does OO tell us in this debate? Autonomy and state power. Panel, we don't think that the peacekeeping forces just invade your country when you are not doing anything and you are just existing as a country. In most instances, this is how peacekeeping forces work, when there is violence or when there is threat of violence in these places. But then secondly, when they feel like the citizens themselves are not being protected and their governments are impeding on like these citizens etc. Things like extreme human rights violations like genocide etc. that happen in states. We think that in this debate it cannot be about the fact that at the end of the day they are just going to like infringe on your autonomy. Even like in most instances like that, it is better for us to infringe on your autonomy than to watch for 1 million of people to die in these particular instances. We don't see how that's a better world. But then secondly, they say that instability will exacerbate. We think that in today's debate, right, like the world that actually exacerbates instability or is the world that you exist in. Because in most of these states that like these things happen, the outcome is that there is no one to protect you, etc. The reason why UN military forces, and the reason why ECOWAS military forces do not work is that one, they are stretched thin. ECOWAS does not have enough resources in order to build the ECOMOG. But then secondly, the UN military forces are spread thin because there are so many like violence that is going on around the world and war that's going on around the world, so they do not have the ability to act as quickly as they should be able to act. But the panel, they say that you subdue people. Panel, we don't see how we subdue people in our world. Note, check your notes. There is no mechanization as to how we subdue people in today's debate. They don't show us. All that they say is that because Commonwealth exists and they have a peacekeeping force, they are going to subdue people. We don't see how that is something that is likely to happen in today's debate. Plus, I've analyzed to you how Commonwealth accepts the diversification of like ideas, etc. That is why they allow countries that were not even colonized in the past to join the Commonwealth. Countries like Rwanda that exist in the Commonwealth in status quo. We believe that the Commonwealth does not do that. My panel, before my extension, yes. So, panel, like I've already explained this, I told you that one, because it's that this house believes that X showed motion, it means that it's about the actor taking an action. What that means is that any other actor that exists beyond this actor taking an action is not something that's our business. But then secondly, most of these military forces are ones that are spread thin. I've already explained this, panel. I don't know why he's asking that POI. Should have asked a better POI. It's closing. Okay, moving on to our extensions. Panel, why is this better when it's done by the Commonwealth? Because just like they say, like there are so many like cry outs for neocolonialism. The idea that this is done by the Commonwealth means that in most instances, it is done by all of these people coming together to add their military forces. What that means is that it's a contribution. You feel like you are a stakeholder in this particular thing. It is better because then it is very unlikely for the things that they say like infiltration to happen, because it is also, you are also a stakeholder in these military forces and it's unlikely for that to happen. But then secondly, on the impact on citizens and how we protect citizens in today's debate. Panel, note that in most instances, international organizations do not just exist to protect states, they exist to protect citizens. That is why, like, the IMF give loans and give structural adjustments so that they make sure that the impact of it is seen, so that they make sure that citizens actually benefit from this or have economic impact. In today's debate, we think that in any circumstance where citizens are in the Commonwealth are being at a disadvantage because of the analysis I've already given you on how alternatives do not work, it is very hard for help to get to them sooner. In our world, the Commonwealth is going to be easier, or it's easier for them to do this because in today's debate, it's like easier because there are 56 countries who have come together to put like an army together. They are not one. But secondly, in most instances, they are most likely their priority because it's not ECOWAS or the UN that has to care about all West African states or has to care about like all states in the world. But the panel, we think that in most instances, the protection for these citizens is something that's very, very important, because in any particular circumstance, for them to be able to enroll out these scholarships, etc., these citizens have to be protected first and have to exist. What that means is that in any particular point in time, the security of these citizens is one that should be placed as a priority. But then lastly, we think that at any point in time, why shouldn't we do anything else but do this particular thing? We think that it is very important for us to do this particular thing. Because, lastly, panel, we think that's very important for us to do this particular thing because it gives leeway for us to take better actions and us to gain enough relevance in order to take better actions for these Commonwealth states. Lastly, we think that these states deserve better because in status quo, even though they are getting something, they are not getting enough reparations, etc. Because of the principle that exists, that these states have not been developed enough. They have not developed their militaries enough. They don't have enough funds to develop their militaries and their army, etc. We think that it is better for the states to do this because these states in themselves themselves deserve better. Their resources are not as they should be because they were colonized. They don't have the money. We think that in status quo, it is much better for us to do this. Proudly opening government.
Hi. So I'll just start by shouting out my partner. He's been amazing throughout the tournament. And Denise, amazing person. I'd also like to shout out University of Nairobi Debate Association and my parents for all the logistics. And also in a special way, I'd like to shout out Edwin and Ranjos. So yeah. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel. So this debate, like these military things already exist elsewhere. The question is, why should Commonwealth do it? We think it exists in AU and UN. Why it works is because these are countries that came together after colonization and formed like these things to help them like maintain their sovereignty. Why is it bad for Commonwealth to do this, and why are the impacts particularly very bad? So Commonwealth is consisting of like British people, like British countries that necessarily colonized some of this country. We think at that particular point, even on principle, it's better for you to teach the people how to fish rather than just fish for them. We think that particular intervention in this particular state inhibits their sovereignty, which is the core reason as to why Commonwealth was formed. You have that soft spot that necessarily you want to take care of these states. This then means that the principle of sovereignty of state is logically prior to anything that these people say in terms of like they should intervene. We think that's particularly very problematic when Commonwealth decides to do this. But they tell you that Commonwealth has resources and the capacity to do this. We concede from opening opposition that that is true. However, we don't think the only way they can help this developing countries is by interfering or like intervening in those particular states using military coups. The problem is that these countries are facing violence and all these things. The best way is not to form a military coup and just to invade this country. But they tell you that they only invade when violence happens. Why do we think this is still bad? How do people perceive this intervention? We think these are British colonies that still colonized you. You're still trying to heal. You still have wounds. That intervention in and of itself is particularly very problematic to these particular states. But what then happens is that you get backlash and you get a clear analysis on what happened in Niger when the ECOWAS tried to invade. What happened is ECOWAS is a state that like these are states in these regions and tried to invade one country, and they got so much backlash for this particular action. What are the impacts then if a country that is necessarily responsible for your colonization tries to inhibit your sovereignty? We think the sovereignty of this state is something we are willing to defend on from OO. We think the alternatives exist. Commonwealth could like use the resources and capacity to even pass the like weapons and all these things to give these people a chance to like fight for themselves. Secondly, they could have trainings for these particular states. We don't think there's necessity for them to come with military like whatever to just help these countries. We think the problem is how do we maintain peace and how do we incorporate Commonwealth to necessarily maintain this peace. The intervention in this particular state is what we are not standing for. In like the intervention through military is something we are not ready to defend from OO. We think that's a very bad thing. But secondly, what does OG tell you? OG tells you that one, Commonwealth needs to maintain its relevance. We think even if that is true, the best way is not to intervene. Why do we think this is true? Because at the point you intervene, you now get backlash. What then happens is that these countries buy out from Commonwealth itself. This necessarily means that the relevance of Commonwealth goes down as opposed to going up. We think relevance is not an argument they could argue in this debate. But secondly, they tell you that these are developing countries and the problem is that they have violence. We've already engaged with you and told you why. This intervention necessarily just hinders like the whole idea of like creating peace. What you do is now you create geopolitical tensions within Commonwealth itself. That is not what Commonwealth would want. We think that's particularly very bad. But secondly, they tell you that justification for these countries for Commonwealth to invade in these countries is because like people are dying and all these things. We think the principle of sovereignty is enough justification as to why they shouldn't interfere. If anything, there exists alternatives as to why they should, like, as to how they can help these developing countries maintain like peace and all these things. There is no need for like interference or like intervention in this particular state. That's very problematic. Shoot.
Wait, countries can leave the Commonwealth at any time. What that means is that any country still in the Commonwealth fundamentally buys into their ideologies. But number two, when the UN invades a country, do they invade the sovereignty of this country in today's debate?
Okay, I already tell you that the UN is particularly very different from Commonwealth. Commonwealth has countries that necessarily colonized you in the first place. This is particularly very problematic. What UN is a fundamental like countries that came together after the World War. We think that is particularly very problematic. But secondly, Commonwealth has already like, okay, like these countries have like are already in this particular Commonwealth and they are buying into their ideologies and all these things. We think then introducing an ideology or introducing another policy that makes it able for Commonwealth to interfere with their sovereignty necessarily causes a lot of backlash and buyout from this state. It's unclear as to me as to how like that like is important in this debate. But let's engage on why we think even if this country, like even if Commonwealth is intervening at only times where you are having like violence and all these things, and let's do like a comparative. The comparative is on our side is Commonwealth like helps these countries in different ways, training soldiers, giving them weapons, but not actively interfering in these spaces. We think that's bad, even if you're only interfering in instances where these people are violent. But secondly, we tell you the nature of these developing states, that they are really fragile. Interfering with their sovereignty necessarily harms them so bad that it's like the impacts are creating a lot of geopolitical tension that are necessarily not good. We think the outcome of this is on even like utility, you are able to like maximally like harm a lot of people just because of the ongoing tensions that we prove to you will happen. But thirdly, they tell you that Britain does not interfere in safe elections. Fine, but why do they want to start now interfering with your like why do they want to start now interfering with your sovereignty? We think you bringing back that force that necessarily took them to colonialism is particularly very important. They can be there in other like forms and other spaces. We think that's particularly important. But even the perception that people have on this interference is something that is necessarily very harmful to these states and necessarily causes them to like be very unwilling to buy into Commonwealth, and we think that's particularly very problematic in this debate. If you don't get anything from my speech, understand that the principle of sovereignty for this state is particularly very important to them. But secondly, the nature of how they are and how fragile they are right now makes it very, very bad for Commonwealth, which is a country of like people who colonize these countries in the first place, to interfere with them. If they want to help, they can do in so many other forms as opposed to just bringing their military into these spaces. Never been proud to oppose.
Okay, I'm audible, I guess. So before I start my speech, first of all, thanks to God for bringing us here. Special shout out to Veritas University for being super supportive and funding us all the way here. Shout out to my family. I know you guys don't watch my debate videos, but yeah, shout out either way. Shout out to Flat24. And then a special shout out to the judges I clashed, so they can't judge this final. Yeah? So, yeah. I'll start now. Okay, shout out to UG kids. I'm really proud of you guys. Okay, starting in 3. I don't do that, sorry. So I'm just going to be really clear. The problem with having Kenyans and Ghanaians debate about conflict is that they've never seen what war looks like. Because if you understand what war looks like, you understand that if you choose to go into the midst of a conflict and offer training, yeah, you do two things. Either you pick a side, which is worse than peacekeeping, definitely, right? Every bad thing that happens in their world happens either ways. Or you choose to be neutral and you train both sides. Guess what happens when you teach both sides in a war how to kill very effectively? More people die. It's common sense. But moving past that, right, is you need to understand in very clear terms. If you are in the midst of conflict, massive amounts of people are dying. Your family members are in risk. The last thing you give a shit about is whether or not you get to vote who your president or your leader is, whether your government is actually taking decisions because of you. what you would often objectively prioritize is an end to that conflict, the ability to live your life peacefully, and when you then have peace, you can then consider sovereignty. The implicit concession that occurs in this thought process is that sovereignty would never be more important than saving lives and preventing the mass murder and mass killings of people during conflict. This is basic stuff, yeah? But now, let's actually explain why the Commonwealth has a moral obligation to actively ensure peace within the Commonwealth. Because we need to understand how conflict exists within the Commonwealth. The most common types of conflicts in the Commonwealth are border issues, oftentimes formed after, like, the British colonies decided to split off or were split off by Britain, or based off the Berlin Agreement from like the early 1900s. Yeah, the reason why this is contextual is that, one, oftentimes the English were culpable in these processes and were a part of these processes in themselves. So they were oftentimes involved. The second one is tribalism and religious ties. Understand that oftentimes, as a colonial dictator trying to control their country, they oftentimes empower these particular differences and difficulties to the point where it allowed them to have significant influence and control over these people. Understand that these are the three primary reasons why almost every conflict in Commonwealth exists. It's either Kashmiri or Boko Haram. All of these things are divided by either religious ties, tribalistic ties, or border difficulties. At the point in time where this forms the majority of issues that exist within the Commonwealth, it's then safe to assume that the British is implicitly culpable for this violence and this harm, right? So when the British creates a body that says it wants to unite its ex-colonies together, give them some degree of restitution, and unite their powers to allow for mutual development and growth, it becomes really hard to say you're doing that and allow conflict to exist and then do nothing about that conflict, because you have a long-standing moral obligation to then intervene in these instances and then create change. At the point in time where we prove a moral obligation to exist there, we clearly show you why it's important that this exists, right? But panel, why militarization, right? And I think this is just pretty obvious, right? If you don't have guns and weapons and you go and do peacekeeping within a conflict, all you're doing is an observer. People will die, people will get slaughtered, and at best you write like a full report to the ICJ or the ICC. And that's if the war criminal that decides he can kill thousands of people decides that being the one white person there makes you the exemption to his bullet. We think that's unlikely, right? We think you need some degree of militarization to ensure that peacekeeping is effective or sustainable. I think this is pretty obvious. But panel, beyond moral obligation, right? Why is the Commonwealth best suited to solving these kinds of conflict? One, the Commonwealth is aggressively multipolar, right? So in a world that exists today, right, there are oftentimes very strong splits with regards to countries being pro-West, pro-China, or pro-Russia, right? The very interesting thing about the Commonwealth is probably one of the only political bodies or global bodies outside of the UN that is actively able to integrate all of these parties together. So you have very pro-Western countries like Australia and Canada. You also have very pro-China or pro-Russia countries like Pakistan and possibly India that have very strong ties with the non-normative powers, right? The outcome of this is simple, right? Is that the reason why peacekeeping forces oftentimes are ineffective is that because the government that they go into the country with doesn't primarily have the same alliances with them, they tend to make things difficult. When you have a multipolar world, you can always effectively pick military setups that always can have that collaboration and make peacekeeping a whole lot more effective. But a response that also implicitly comes here to OO is because the Commonwealth is multipolar. You can't do things like plunder, because when you send American soldiers, you're also sending Indian soldiers, you're also sending Sri Lankan soldiers. So what happens is that the American soldiers try to plunder for the American government. The Indian soldiers will look at you and say, what the fuck are you doing? Stop that. And intervene in the plundering that happens there. Very clear response. When you try to hijack countries, they will probably do the same thing. Very clear responses there because of the multipolarity that exists within these structures. Second of all, this is pretty intuitive. Less language barriers. Every Commonwealth country has English speakers. While there are also native language speakers, it's more difficult to find a French person that also speaks French and possibly Hausa in Nigeria than find an English person that also speaks English and Hausa. So less language barriers. It means if you want to find out what's going on during the conflict, it's a lot more easy. It's a lot more effective. It's a lot faster. Understand that saving time is the most obvious way of saving lives within this world. The effectiveness there is implicitly obvious, right? But primarily because they have a back record and history of colonialism. A lot of people that are part of the Commonwealth have a better understanding of this conflict than external bodies like the UN or the AU. What that means is that they just simply understand the nature of the conflict a whole lot better and understand the best ways to achieve solvency in this, right? But what happens when this process exists in the long term? We think we get a cumulative drive towards solutions. Why? Because for every time the Commonwealth succeeds, right, what happens is because they are solving the exact same type of problems, right? Which are oftentimes these three core issues. They begin to form like an existing policy document or a status quo effective solution that they themselves are uniquely privileged to execute in all these issues. Which means that for every success, it accrues into creating another success down the line. The reason why the UN and the AU are just implicitly worse at this is because the UN is perceived as Western controlled by most bodies, and that implicitly means that they are oftentimes ineffective. The AU is objectively weak, and it's stronger than most regional bodies that exist where Commonwealth countries are. In Asia, there is no strong military force or even strong peacekeeping force to negotiate peace between Pakistan and India, right? So all of these conflicts are significantly much better solved within the Commonwealth. The objective way in here is simple. We want to save lives, right? We want to make sure that less people die. And we've shown you very clearly that we don't want people to die. We want wars to end as quickly as possible. They have economic impacts. They have physical impacts. They have traumatizing impacts. They have harms on people's mental health, harms on people's human rights. We think at the end of the day, we create a much better world when we just protect these lives, we allow people to live happy lives, and we just move people further into peace. In the worst case scenario where we lose this particular sovereignty, at the point in time where we give people their lives and allow them to live more peaceful worlds, it's a hill I'm still willing to die on. We're very proud to take this trophy back to Nigeria.
Okay. Since everyone is giving shout-outs, I think it's important that I do that too. Shout-outs to our coach, sports directorate, I think that has been done. But more importantly, to my partner, she has been amazing. She's a star of the show. She'll come and give the best speech in this tournament. We're winning this thing. Okay, so we agree with Ayafa that the Commonwealth has a moral obligation to solve conflicts when they arise. But we don't think a militarized peacekeeping is the way to solve these conflicts within these areas, and it will exacerbate issues. People will die more. They don't achieve anything on their side. I'll be doing two things in this debate. I'll be providing extensions in the way as to why we beat everybody in this debate from CO. A couple of things then in framing. Why does the Commonwealth exist, and what necessitates a peacekeeping force? One, that the Commonwealth is in summary just like a social club of countries with one colonial history. And as a social club, they have fundamentally, through advocacy and diplomacy, achieved great feats of fighting for human rights, like their role in advocacy against apartheid in South Africa and LGBTQ rights globally. But secondly, they have facilitated a relationship between these countries to ensure democracy within these spaces. This is the inherent value of the Commonwealth. But the second thing in framing is what necessitates a peacekeeping force. Peacekeeping forces are only relevant when conflict exists on two levels. One, intrastate conflict, and two, interstate conflict. Given that what the Commonwealth cares about is democracy and human rights, the kind of conflicts they'll be engaging with will have the following characteristics. On an intrastate level, a bigger force oppressing a smaller force within a region. Secondly, what this means is that usually the state is the bigger force in that conflict because of two reasons. One, they have a monopoly on power, like firearms and military forces, to be able to push their ideas. But two, they have bigger platforms to create narratives about the conflict, to get mass populace to support them, or even at worst to keep them silent, from stopping them from committing the crimes they're committing. But on an interstate level, the second kind of conflict is coups, where the military and some part of the populace think that the government is bad and they need to be removed. But on an interstate level, it's usually when border skirmishes and when a country wants to annex another country for whatever reason and for whatever narratives that exist on that regard. So a couple of responses in that. The idea that a militarized peacekeeping force make the Commonwealth look like a powerful threat to keep all these countries at bay doesn't exist, because given that already powerful powers exist in status quo like the UN, and these countries are still acting in these capacities, deterrence is a wash. Deterrence can't be a case or response in that regard. And a couple of other things you then need to note is that wars inherently have an atmosphere that induces irrationality. Everything accentuates because people's survival is a threat. This means that when you give a man a gun, they are more likely to use it. Force will be seen. So on these two levels, what this essentially means that the real impact they achieve in the world is when force comes around, fighting happens. But why is this essentially bad for the Commonwealth? Three things then you need to know. Given the history of the Commonwealth and colonialism that has already been talked about in this debate. But secondly, given that there's already a global perception that a lot of the countries are associating with the Commonwealth because they want to hide behind the good of the Commonwealth to do bad. And thirdly, given that these states have pondered to British demands in Commonwealth decision-making, like in status school, this means that inherently people think they're imperialists or they are bad actors. Why is this bad in peacekeeping? Given the description of these conflicts I have given, it is very easy for the Commonwealth to look bad as a peacekeeping actor than any other actor in this debate. How? In intrastate wars, what you have is that two things, you can have only two options in peacekeeping when you send your forces. The first option is to support the state in oppressing the people, or the second option is to support the minority against the state that is being oppressed. These are your only two options, because if you decide to remain neutral, because of how polarized conflicts exist, either side will begin to ponder to narratives that say that you are an evil person and you are the enemy, and as Ayafa says, they'll be shooting you regardless of if you have good intentions on that regard. And this is especially true within coups. Picking a side also would mean that you will not get the kind of support that you need. For example, if you pick the side of the minorities, you get significant opposition from the state, because the state will use media to push narratives that you're imperialists, you're bad actors, like infringing on their sovereignty, so you can't do as much in that regard. But if you ponder to the state, minorities will not respond to you because these are the people you're trying to protect. They will not engage with your forces for you to be able to help them in any degree. Legitimacy on ground is important for peacekeeping to work on any front. That is why it's bad. But even more bad is the kind of up that will come from states, especially if you don't support these states, is that when powerful forces feel like their power is threatened, what they do is that they get allies. Allies means that the war will continue to exist because they keep getting support to make this conflict continue to happen. You don't achieve anything on that front. What this means that, secondly, on interstate wars, is that when you decide to enter a war between two states, especially if the other state is not a member country, you need to support your member country, or they're going to have threats like, I'm going to leave, or I'm not going to engage with the Commonwealth. The relevance that they want to create in the world doesn't exist because people will be pulling out because they think the Commonwealth doesn't support them. Then, what is the question in this debate? How then is the best way for the Commonwealth to solve this conflict? Because that is what we think is important. Beyond what it means for the Commonwealth, this is a debate that is not an actor debate. We need to give analysis as to why this is best for the people involved in the conflict and best for the world. The way to solve this conflict is through negotiations. Before I get into the analysis on that, POI from Ayafa. Ayafa, you see, that is idealistic in nature inherently, because what happens in the most number of cases is that there's going to be a narrative within this polarized conflict that will inherently make you an enemy in that regard. France has peacekeeping forces that are helping them fight, jihadists and people that are killing people. But then there's a narrative that exists that these people are the inherent enemy, and that is why coups have existed to push these people out inherently. Polarized narratives will always make you the enemy. That is the case in the debate. So a couple of things then. Why is negotiation going to happen in the best way for the Commonwealth? One, given that the Commonwealth already has a history of making significant strides with advocacy, but secondly, given that the states have an interest to associate with the Commonwealth inherently, that is why they are still part and they have not left yet, then you get a couple of things. You are able to get them to sit at the table to negotiate, to make progress and solve conflict. Even if you get peacekeeping force on ground, peacekeeping force don't end the conflict. They just keep the conflict going and maintain the conflict. The way you actually get solutions is when negotiations happen. And negotiations will never happen, especially when it is easier for you to be looking like the bad side, to get either side of the conflict on the table for negotiations to happen inherently. We think looking like aggressors on either side of the polarized conflict doesn't allow you to bring them to negotiate. You don't achieve anything in their world, and then you don't solve the conflict, which is the most important thing in this debate. At the end of the day, we think that the Commonwealth, given that they've already painted themselves as a neutral actor, as he says, gathering people with different political ideas together to be able to exist as one big family, it is important that they remain that way and not interfere in a way that makes them look like aggressors on either side of the conflict. We think that is most important in this debate. We win because we want the Commonwealth to negotiate. No militarized peacekeeping forces. That is how we keep peace.
I'll be giving my own shout out to my debate president, Jojo, who has never won the finals. I'm sure she'll be watching this. So just on the grounds that we're going to win these finals for her and dedicate especially to Jojo. She's just a little debater who has never won the finals. No other shout out, not even to my school, not to anyone, especially not to my friend Amos. All right. So I'm going to take POIs from only OG, from only OO. Because at the end of this rebuttals, my whip speech, you just discover that, CG is just largely going to rank fourth, even if there's no team in this debate. Okay, let's start. So I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. at the very core of long-lasting conflicts that exist between Commonwealth states, like the idea of Pakistan and India and other regions, especially when IAFA shows you the unique nature of this conflict. It therefore means that the team that must win today's debate is the team that best solves this conflict, especially when all alternatives are in interaction, and we must create that utility of peacekeeping, which is the major principle that exists in today's debate, especially when all their alternatives look like the UN, right? And in most instances, especially when IAFA shows you that you even get worse of impact when the UN are involved, because of course there's less stakes within that space. We're very, very proud to take this trophy to Nigeria. So let me just engage, CO first before I go to OO, just on the grounds of, who is fourth and who is third in today's debate, because these guys just have a privilege not to rank fourth the same, you understand? Okay. First of all, they don't think that militarization is the better approach. But he doesn't tell you any other thing aside negotiation. Listen to IAFA's piece of material and compare it to the idea of negotiation with irrational people. That's his context. He says people are going to be irrational within conflicts, right? So how do you negotiate with irrational people? So you don't give a context, and then your alternative look like it's counterintuitive to the context that you then create in this debate. Because we don't think that when you say people are going to be irrational, notice that there's a large concept of misconception with what peacekeeping look like from these guys. So it looks like, peacekeeping comes in and they take a side. Lies. It looks like, peacekeeping comes in and they begin to, just shank one team over, and that's a problematic state. No, peacekeeping looks like this, right? Especially when IAFA tells you what happens in DR Congo, right? The first thing they intend to do is just to create a ceasefire, right? Even their word of negotiation still happens in our world, because when there's a ceasefire, there's a likelihood to even get that negotiation in the first instance. But on the second response to this, which is more important, right? We think that when you have a neutral floor who is less likely going to have any stakes within these two parties as grounds of, what those irrational bodies look like, we think that those negotiations can even happen on a better phase, right? Peacekeeping do not intend to stop wars just automatically, right? We don't think that's the idea. Very, very much unfair for me to just defend the idea in our world. But it actually creates the first impact, which is ceasefire. That is the first step to getting anything at the outcome of peacekeeping. We are the only team that prioritizes saving lives in today's debate. Any other thing they tell you must match up with the principle IAFA gives you, except these guys don't engage the heart of today's debate, right? But of course, if you have killed my mother, right, or, within those conflicts, because he just spends a lot of time showing what internal conflict look like, right? For instance, if there was a peacekeeping group, in the civil war in Nigeria, we don't think that those wars would actually, be as detrimental as they were, right? So it doesn't matter whether, big minorities are just shanking, big majorities are just shanking minorities and all of those type of things. We just think that the idea in today's debate is that if you are going to create, impact in your world, you should just do better. The better side in opening opposition. The summary of their case and the biggest case you get from them is sovereignty. IAFA's response is that, we cannot compare the principle of sovereignty to the principle of saving lives. Their response to the argument or everything they say is just feeble and does not respond or does not create any impact in today's debate. Because we think countries will be almost very much willing to trade off certain levels of sovereignty, especially when it creates peace and preserves life, right? Because if everybody dies in the states, maybe states are you actually creating autonomy for? It's just very, very, very weird. Okay, they claim that, we think that, these guys are not trustworthy because they are just, going to create an extension of colonialism and all of those type of things. The alternative you have, one, is the UN. And we think it's very, very much problematic because, of course, peacekeeping will happen if the UN send their troops. IAFA already clearly shows you why the stakes on our side is just outweighs anything that they tell you. Because they say, the UN is just going to do this better. One, there's a large distrust on the grounds of the UN as it currently stands now, especially when they're just quiet to the Palestine issue that actually happens. But that's a very, very political shift. We're not going to engage that word in today's debate. But when that distrust actually happens, we don't think that the UN is the best alternative to actually create in today's debate. To the extent where you don't show us, an alternative that, one, understands the issue better than what IAFA tells you on the grounds of language and just on the grounds of understanding what those issues look like, you don't win today's debate. But every other thing that tells you is that, we can even have like regional spaces and all of those things. And they just give these crazy alternatives that look like, we should just send them biscuits or mosquito nets as aid because we think that's the best way to just engage it. We think that the aids that have been sent to Palestine have never gotten to them just on the grounds of that conflict. You don't get those sort of outcomes when there are conflicts in those regions. Today's debate is beyond just arguing what you think looks shiny, right? Engage the debate as the heart stand and let's show you why you actually just rank, All right, I'll take you in my 5th minute. I still have time. Okay, a comparison with what you get from OG. Because we think it's already a golf bench win, right? Because we just think like it's very, very much important to show you why we rank above our opponents, especially when these guys are both out, even without their whip speech. The first thing is that, OG thinks that, the Commonwealth just exists very normative. And this is the first thing they give you. That, we think that there's a need for the Commonwealth to show its powers and, just show why they need to be more symbolic in status quo. Let's compare to what you get from IAFA. 1, the rationale you get from IAFA is that there's a moral obligation that exists for leaders who set up, the Commonwealth to ensure there's a preservation of life, especially where most conflicts arise in those regions are due to historical colonial actions we think that they are culpable of. Compare it to what you get as just being symbolic and creating or just existing as a very world-known power and all of those type of things. You don't get that weight of impact on that side of the house. We introduce the first principle into this debate. Ignore the comparison between sovereignty and preservation of lives you get from these guys, right? But the next thing is when everything up tells you is true in today's debate, right? We think that, our world is just relatively better. That just on the grounds of having an extra peacekeeping force, which just makes it better, right? That's even if everything they tell you is true, just having like an extra peacekeeping force just makes it relatively better in today's debate. 1, we think that there's so much benefit that just exists with, having peacekeeping force, which is just like military, right? Because we defend the military idea, and these guys just come as if they didn't pay attention to what IAFA is saying. IAFA said, the reason why there need to be a military presence because every other thing you get is just on the grounds of observation. You don't create any impact. That's a direct response to their case, even if IAFA already think that. But we think that Commonwealth just on its multipolar nature, African states that they complain about because they say, developing countries, will just lose out on stakes within these guys and they have a very large problem with that. We have more stakes when, Commonwealth peacekeeping, military force is actually rooted in this space because 1, we are belonging to this space. It's just better for us than the UN, right? We don't have so much stakes within the UN and all of that thing. If you compare the narrative or the comparison you have on the other side of the house, it doesn't just work. But at the point where we are the only team that best preserves life in this debate, show the effective nature of Commonwealth as compared to anything you get, show the idea that the UN and the AU and any regional peacekeeping force don't do as much as we create in our side of the house. The only thing that defend the idea of militarization of this peacekeeping force, we're very, very much proud to tell you this trophy is very, very halfway to Nigeria. Incredibly proud to win from CG.
Hi, I hope everyone can see me. But if you can't see me, you probably can't hear me, so that is fine. Again, shout out to Elisha. We all love you here. And thank you for all the sacrifices. All right. You see, the problem with the closing governments in this debate is that they're extremely dismissive of our arguments. So they don't take into consideration a lot of things that Andrew tells you. And we think it's extremely unfair. But what exactly is our case? Our case is not that the peacekeeping forces are ultimately have bad incentives to go into war, and for that reason, they are going to be bad people. We think that in times of war, there are extreme mechanisms that make it more likely that the peacekeeping force will be seen as a bad actor by either side of the parties. And we think that that is a bad thing that we should not have. What does Andrew tell you? Andrew tells you that there's an incentive for every side of the house to want to believe that the peacekeeping force should do something to benefit them. In a time where the peacekeeping force does not do that, they are seen as a party or an external force that's on the side of the other side. We think that's extremely bad. Why? Because we think that the Commonwealth, as an actor, needs to maintain its neutrality in all wars or in all issues of human rights abuses for the simple reason that they have a unique role in advocacy. But secondly, right, we think that the media of the state or people that have power in times of these wars have unique opportunity to control things like propaganda and media to create fascist ideologies that then make the Commonwealth look more like a bad actor that they actively need to clamp down against. We think that the best option in our world, and here is the exact comparative, is that negotiations can happen to lead to peace. They tell you that the first thing that the peacekeeping forces will do would be to enforce a ceasefire. But PAN will recognize that ceasefires only come about after a negotiation has happened. That then means that on our side, negotiations need to happen first. But negotiations will never happen if the Commonwealth peace force is seen as an actor that is antagonized by one side of the party. Why will negotiations happen on our end? Negotiations, notice how negotiations happen. There needs to be an objective person, but that objective person needs to be someone who doesn't look like an active aggressor. Pano, notice, giving a gun to someone, no matter their incentives, in the context of a war, makes them look makes them feel that they have certain power to protect themselves, one, but power to protect people that they are meant to protect. That then means that the idea that they have power because of the guns that they have or because of the military weapons that they have puts them in a place where they are more likely going to irrationally use that power. But secondly, the idea of head mentality in times of war. In times of war, the unique incentive of everybody, even if you are meant to protect other people, is to protect yourself first. What it then means is that even if you had good incentives in before coming into the war, no matter what happens, you would always want to protect yourself first. But even that, everybody within as a peacekeeping force acts as a unit. So IAFA cannot come and run that the Americans will be plundering and the Indians will say they don't want to do that because they act as a unit because of the head mentality that they are going there for a common purpose. That then means that argument is a wash. But why do they say they win this debate? They tell you, first of all, that they save lives, and that is why they win this debate. Why would they not save lives? I think based on everything that I have said, you get the import of this. But in times of war, normally people die. There needs to be a unique reason why a peacekeeping force would save lives of other people. Why would this not happen? In times of these wars, both factions are increasingly polarized. But the thing is that if you give them more force, you give them a more incentive to do bad. But even beyond that, having force means that even if you save one life, you are most likely going to be extreme in the methods in which you save that one life. So if you want to save someone from getting attacked, you are most likely going to be very brutal in the way that you do those things, or you are most likely going to be disproportionately killing people to save one life that you think is better to be saved in that end. We don't think that is a good thing. We believe that if you want to save lives, you need to do it the right way by solving the problem at its roots, by engaging in negotiations. What they do in their world, even if they are ultimately good actors, is that they extend the periods of the war when negotiations can be had from a point of a neutral third party without force. We think that first, even if peace forces are necessary, we don't think that the Commonwealth should be the actor that engages in this peace force. Why? Because of what IAFA tells you. The Commonwealth is highly multipolarized. What does this mean? It means that in the Commonwealth, there are people that believe in different things and different things that should be protected. That means that for every action that the Commonwealth takes, there would always be certain form of opposition from certain actors within the Commonwealth. We think that they have a unique role in advocacy because they are able to bring the multipolar factions together to believe in one idea or to believe that they have to come to certain consensus. If they can't do that by picking a side, then we think that the Commonwealth loses its unique role. We think that there are other actors like the UN, like the EU, the ECOWAS, that don't have that unique role in advocacy that brings several other people together. OG.
I first case on internal conflict use the same mechanisms and have the same impact as our principal justification cases. It doesn't have an extension. But two, our case on the diversity of Commonwealth and our stakeholder responses are actually more feasible than their case of multipolar worlds in today's debate. Engage the actual debate.
Panel, we think that moving on from everything that I have already discussed, the next thing we need to understand is the idea of cumulative drive for success. That IAFA tells you that if they succeed in one war, they are most likely going to succeed in other wars because they already have experience as to what these things look like. First response on that. We think that even if the issues may be similar, the sentiments may be different. So the people that you engage with always different for every war. That means that you can't have a standard form of engaging with all of them. But why do you think, even if they succeed, having standard forms of engaging with what's extremely bad? Notice that most of the time, cumulative policies are set by very powerful actors within those societies or within the Commonwealth. What it also means is that you reduce the ability to have dynamism when you engage with other people. The reason why it is extremely bad is that you have rigid applications that can actively harm other people that you are trying to help in this debate. Panel, what is our case in this debate and why do we take this debate? We think that even for any side in this room, they need to defend two things. One, that they will constantly make the world a better place. Two, that this is an action that is necessary for the Commonwealth to take. Why do we win on those two ventures? First, we don't think that you make the world a better place because you actively polarize more people within the Commonwealth and you actively make the Commonwealth look like a bad actor. Impact of this is that you reduce the advocacy power of the Commonwealth, which is extremely important for two reasons. For basically the same reason, right? Because of the multipolar idea of people, multipolarized, because of the fact that there are several people with different ideas within the Commonwealth, and you can't be seen as someone that has taken a stand, and you will prolong the wars or conflict.
But how do we say that it is not necessary for the Commonwealth? We believe that it is simple. Other actors have an incentive to do it. We don't even think the Commonwealth has the capacity to do it because their budget was shut down, like was slashed in half a couple of years ago. They don't have the money to do it. Their increased political